It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beauty wood, a neighborly day for a beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? My neighbor? I'm glad we're together again today.
It's official. In 3 months from the release of this video, I will be taking my first rather long hiatus on this channel. And while I can't say exactly how long I will be gone for, the fact that I am, in very short order, going to be placing a coda on this YouTube channel's lifespan has me in a very contemplative mood, thinking about the videos that I really need to make, the videos that I've promised to make. Time is limited, and there's a certain number of things you just want to get out there before you're eventually forced to put down the microphone. But more than videos that I want to make that I may never get around to, confronting this channel's upcoming hiatus has me in a more historic mood. Although I have every intention to come back to making videos after the hiatus, I am for a time going to have to transition from being a YouTuber to having been a YouTuber at one point. And I think an interesting question to ask is, what does it mean to have been a YouTuber? Or should I say, what does it mean to have been a political YouTuber between the years of 2016 to 2019? I will say that if there is one emotion that I'm facing before my hiatus, it is one of humility and privilege. I feel privileged to be able to participate in the ideas community of YouTube, to be able to share my thoughts with other people at this time. Since I first found the political YouTube community in 2013, I have maintained and still maintain that larger cultural and political trends start on YouTube and then filter down to other media organizations. Twitter might be the buzz that's happening now, and Reddit might be the front page of the internet, but YouTube is where the community of younger people go to think and hash out their serious ideas and identities. And while I still don't think you're going to find the same caliber of thought on a video platform than you will in a classic book of philosophy or literature, still, comparatively speaking, I think you're more likely to find new and interesting ideas here than you are in any mainstream media source, cable news or Facebook. I don't know, perhaps there is a bit of vainglory in that, but it's true as far as I can see. But in addition to just being able to participate in this experience called YouTube, I also think I've been quite privileged by the particular time I've been active on YouTube. Starting in 2016, I think that I caught the beginning of a phenomenon on YouTube, a transition away from frivolity and towards more serious cultural and political issues. YouTube, between 2016 and 2020, has had its own era of intellectual exploration. And while this might be just the beginning of a larger phenomenon, a larger deepening of the platform, I think it's interesting to see the era of 2016 to 2019 in context with what came before. I think for political YouTube in particular, the medium has gone through at least 3 phases since it originated. Of course, early on in YouTube's existence, it was more or less just a platform for pranks and cat videos, so I would say that the first distinct phase of political YouTube began around 2008 and 2009. This largely coincided with the New Atheist phenomenon started by Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens. It also coincided with more or less the end of the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration, a very optimistic time for progressives, and also those people who consider themselves skeptics of tradition and conservative ideas generally. This first phase of YouTube, which was dominated by people like Pat Condell, TJ the Amazing Atheist, and Thunderfoot, largely focused on skepticism. Most of the popular political channels of that time, in fact, identified with the label skeptic. And generally, in addition to their just plain skepticism, they took more or less a moderate progressive view towards politics and any questions of a larger political or cultural nature generally. The typical channel of this era was born out of rejecting bad ideas, not being stupid, laughing at those people who they thought were stupid or could be demonstrated to be irrational. There wasn't any discussion of larger positive ideas because, at that time, for the most part, people of the age that typically watched YouTube, e.g. people in their early or mid-20s, didn't feel like they really needed to have a positive philosophy. Furthermore, the cultural zeitgeist of the era was one of rejection, a mode of clearing away old norms that had been keeping us back, and looking forward to something new that was to come, regardless of exactly what the design of that new thing was. I know I've said this in other videos, but I think the two true authors of the 2009 YouTube persona were none other than Christopher Hitchens and Jon Stewart. Christopher Hitchens, a progressive turned neocon turned arch skeptic, in 2008 was at the height of his form. Although he didn't really have any positive ideas to talk about, not the least of which because his one big idea in the past 10 years, the neoconservative foreign policy, had turned out to be an enormous flop, most people loved listening to Christopher Hitchens eloquently denounce religion and really any other mode of traditionalism that he considered to be antiquated and anti-enlightenment. It ultimately didn't matter if Christopher Hitchens was a Trotskyist or a neocon or maybe even both. All we cared about were the bad ideas that Christopher Hitchens so loved to eloquently denounce. It was fun. Listening to him, you could feel like you were on the right side of things. And I think many YouTubers at this time took a page out of Christopher Hitchens' book on this account. The other large influence on the YouTuber persona of 2009 probably was Jon Stewart, a quote-unquote comedian who, during the Bush era, ran the most popular political commentary channel on cable television. Once more, like Christopher Hitchens, Jon Stewart's bread and butter was critique, was scoffing. Insofar as he had an ideology or some model of how the universe should be, it was just common sense and don't be stupid. Two things it seemed like all of Jon Stewart's targets had a very hard time doing. Jon Stewart's Daily Show and later spin-offs like The Colbert Report, and even much later affairs like Samantha Bee and John Oliver, focused very much on the same formula: pure criticism, pure critique, with the assumption that the default position would be some kind of moderate progressivism. As Stephen Colbert was very fond of saying, reality has a well-known liberal bias. And once more, I think you could see this very prominently in YouTubers at the time, be it TJ the Amazing Atheist's default liberalism, or even the generally progressive stances you'd see in most other smaller YouTube skeptics. And this combination of moderate progressivism with skepticism was a tried and true formula, I think until around 2012 to 2013, when, as they say, times began to change. Moving into 2013, the mainstream progressive movement took a hard turn left. Ideas that had once only been seen in universities became mainstream, and with them a number of knock-on effects that thoroughly infected the atheist community. This started with some well-known and funny scandals such as Elevator Gate, and also resulted in some short-term movements like Atheism Plus. Each one of these events divided the atheist community between their liberal and progressive counterparts, with those who like identity politics being on one side and those more skeptical of the left-wing turn on the other. The war over wokeness had commenced, but strangely and funnily enough, none of this really came to full head until wokeness came after video games. Here, of course, I'm thinking of two things: the emergence of Anita Sarkeesian as an internet phenomenon, criticizing video games for being sexist, and later, the phenomenon of Gamergate and all of the knock-on effects that brought about. At any rate, insofar as YouTube was concerned, it became the front page for the counterattack on feminism and the more woke aspects of the progressive coalition. Between 2013 and 2016, the primary and most popular topic of political YouTube was anti-SJW, anti-feminism content. Of course, the number of anti-SJW YouTubers is probably too numerous to count here, and of course, there were the older YouTubers who jumped on the bandwagon, like The Amazing Atheist and Thunderfoot. Still, to my own mind, two figures really dominate this era of YouTube. The first one being the YouTuber Sargon of Akkad, and the other being the YouTuber Mr. Metaker, or as he was known earlier in his career as the Internet Aristocrat. More than anything else, these two characters turned being angry at feminists into something that was actually fun to watch. But more than that, just like in the last era, Sargon and Mr. Metaker turned out to be more memorable and longer lasting, more because they could predict and in some ways anticipate the end of this era. The fundamental limitations of building a YouTube career around the mockery of a much more powerful political force. As anti-SJW YouTube moved from its prime to its second year, to then later even its third year, everyone could see the writing on the wall. The anti-feminist video was more or less a formula, something that really anybody could do, and as it seemed increasingly, everyone was doing. People were bound to get tired of the repetition at some point. Still, anti-SJW and anti-feminist YouTube had a much larger problem, and that was that they really couldn't secure any lasting victories, politically or institutionally. In the case of the skeptic movement, in the case of the crusades against religion and religious expression in the public sphere, the YouTubers involved were more or less jumping on the bandwagon, joining a movement that was already started by prominent and established celebrities like Dawkins and Hitchens. Moreover, insofar as there were any living battles over the separation of church and state, or the teaching of creationism, the YouTube atheist community had more or less all of its battles fought for it. Separation of church and state had been an established concept that had been strengthened by 30 years of jurisprudence at really all levels of the court. Moreover, creationism was more or less a dead letter insofar as education was concerned. It wasn't taught in public schools, and even its wishy-washy cousin, intelligent design, was dealt a death blow in 2005, 3 years before the main atheist movement really built up its head of steam. In short, the new atheists were more or less flogging a dead horse. Not so with feminism. No matter how much the Gamergaters raged, no matter how much they talked about ethics in journalism, the forces of wokeness and feminism kept on winning victories. The SJWs kept on winning. They maintained their support in the mainstream media, and they maintained their support in the academy. Laugh, cry, or rage, the feminists were winning. And there was only so much time before the entire endeavor started seeming very futile. Pure rejection of ideology, skepticism, and appeals to evidence and rationality weren't going to cut it. There were deeper questions that weren't being asked or answered. And I think for this reason, quite naturally, the third era or phase of YouTube came about, starting in 2016 and going up to the present. And insofar as I'm allowed to characterize an era of political YouTube that I myself participated in, I would say that this era was a much more chaotic and ideologically fraught era in the platform. As opposed to one type of skeptic YouTube channel being popular, characterized mostly by its rejection of something, either religion or feminism, the era between 2016 and 2019 was characterized more as a free-for-all, with a bunch of different ideologies all competing for eyeballs, all competing for attention and approval on the platform. As one might expect, this period is much harder to characterize than its predecessors. Still, coming up on the 3-year mark, I will look back and ask what really characterized the intellectual development of this era. After the dust was settled in the battles between feminists and Marxists, the alt-right and liberalists, between the skeptical and the religious, what ideas or whose ideas really defined this era? Again, it's hard to say. But I already have the very distinct feeling that there are two YouTube personalities that we'll be looking back on as particularly indicative of this period. Just as the first phase of YouTube, in my own mind, was dominated by Thunderfoot and the Amazing Atheist, the second phase was dominated by Sargon of Akkad and Mr. Medicare. There are also two defining figures in this third phase of YouTube. The first one is, of course, the university professor turned intellectual superstar, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. The second, perhaps stranger choice, is none other than the YouTuber ContraPoints, a progressive vlogger who's become amazingly popular for making in-depth video stories and video essays that teach and evangelize for the progressive cause. I know both of these channels seem like polar opposites. They're strange bedfellows for sure. However, both seem to be writing the same type of sociological trends that took place in 2016 and persisted until now. Both figures started their channel at roughly the same time I started mine, and while I initially thought both channels were interesting, I simultaneously didn't have a very large reaction. Whoever Jordan Peterson and ContraPoints were speaking to, it didn't really seem to be me. Nevertheless, I was completely blindsided by the utter success that both of these figures have had in our contemporary age. And since I've been watching them both, I've wanted to make a video essay about them. I've wanted to describe the phenomenon of Jordan B. Peterson and of ContraPoints, because for some strange reason, I felt deeply that they were related, a product of the same phenomenon. Although for the longest time on my channel, I couldn't really put my finger on it, until it finally came to facing the hiatus on my own channel, and I had to take a long look back.